there's three different types of coaches that wake up every morning right now. Okay. There's one when the alarm goes off that he looks at the date on the clock and he goes, oh, geez, I thought I was going to wake up and it's going to be 2019. Okay. Then there's the other guy that hits that alarm, that sees the alarm, gets off, gets out of bed, and he's just like, well, here's the new reality. I guess I have to work in it. And then there's a third coach that wakes up and says, hey, look, it's a whole new world. Regardless of what state I'm in right now, I've got to function. I've got to find a way to win ball games.
Hello, and welcome to the Verbal Commitment Podcast here on the Kansas City Sports Network, brought to you by Home Field Apparel. I'm Kevin Flaherty, and I'm here, as always, with my good friend Ryan Wallace, and we're talking about the world of local recruiting, from Kansas and Kansas City prospects to the college classes at Kansas, Kansas State, and Missouri. We have a great guest this week in Central Michigan assistant coach Brandon Blaney, who many of you may know as Mark Mangino's recruiting coordinator at Kansas when the Jayhawks went to the Orange Bowl. He has a lot of local ties, but we also had a chance to talk to him about the state of college football in general and recruiting and where that is headed in the future. As always, if you like what you're hearing, comment below. Tell your friends about us, subscribe, hit that like button, or leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, like Spotify or Apple. All of those things help us with the algorithm, help us to grow the show, and help put us in front of more people like you. Let's get right into it with prospect profiles this week, Ryan, because we do have a long interview with Coach Blaney coming up. Once again, you are flipping over to the Sunflower State. Well, I, this time, will take a player from Kansas City, Missouri. The guy you have your eye on in the state of Kansas is a guy that's someone that both of us have been fans of for, I feel like, quite some time now.
I was going to say, we saw Braden Maiavella's career kind of get kickstarted as a sophomore at Mays 2 years ago. Went down there to see Bryson Hayes, went down there to see BJ Kennedy, Topeka against Mays, and here trots out this 6'3" sophomore who is now 6'4", over 200 pounds. I've heard from his trainer, Coach Daniels. Shout out Rashad Daniels down there doing great work in Wichita area. They're trying to push him to like 205, 210 by the time that, kind of that camp season rolls around. But, we got to see him as a sophomore as a wide receiver. This past year, we got a chance to see him do a little bit of wide receiver and even more as a quarterback.
Yep.
And I think that's what really flashed his overall athleticism, Kevin. I mean, when you throw his junior tape on, obviously what you're going to see is a ton of this, which is him scrambling outside the pocket. And that's where you get to see, I think, just how well he moves for 6'4", 6'3", 6'4", 190 to 200 pounds. And so obviously I wanted to throw some of these clips on because, yeah, another dual threat quarterback at Mays. Like, we just saw this, right? But it's actually what you see in some of his clips training with Coach Daniels to really polish himself as a wide receiver that have really caught you and I's attention, because it looks so natural for a kid that is not a natural at the position, right? He's a hooper. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to profile him this particular week is he's coming off a basketball season where Mays ended up upsetting the number 1 seed, Shawnee Mission South, in the 6A playoffs, courtesy of Maiavella. I mean, he's probably, you could argue, he's the best hooper on the Mays basketball team. And so, with the way roster restrictions and things like that are, it's going to be tough for Braden in terms of making a dent with the KU or K-State, simply because I don't know if they have the wiggle room to take a risk or a flyer on a kid like they used to. But especially if he goes into this fall and he's asked to play more quarterback. But I think what he and Coach Daniels are doing this offseason is really trying to make a dent in the combine circuit and in the camp circuit this summer to prove himself. Hey, I'm 6'4", over 200 pounds, and I haven't even given wide receiver really the time of day yet, right? I've been a multi-sport athlete. I think arguably Maiavella is the best athlete in the state in terms of the gamesmanship. I think if you rolled a ball out to any court or field, you could argue that with his frame and the things that he can do, he might be just the best overall sports player, right, in the state. You can make that argument. But again, I think this summer it's all about proving to people how far he's come as a receiver and trying to kind of entice people with how far he can go. He's already got a South Dakota offer, so the FCS interest is starting to matriculate. And there's going to be some coaches in some war rooms, right, Kevin, this fall that are going to go, is this worth the investment? Because I think that if he does what we think he can do, there's going to be some staffs out there that are going to say, yeah, he's worth that investment.
Yeah, it would be well worth it for a lot of college staffs to go out and watch him play basketball, because as weird as it sounds, as good as he is on the gridiron, I think you see the movement skills on the basketball court, and that makes things so much easier to project for Braden Maivella at this point. I'm on the Missouri side, and I'm going to go with Park Hill's Jonah Weir, a guy that we considered kind of for that top 10, didn't wind up being in the top 10. Pretty good, explosive athlete on the defensive line. Had 13 tackles for loss, 7 sacks a year ago. And I like the way Andy Sims kind of moves him around a little bit on that defensive line. He has some chances to come off the edge, but also some opportunities to play on the interior as more of like a 4-eye. Here you see him on the edge. And you just see the athleticism, the straight ahead speed and explosion. And here you see him more on the inside shoulder. He still makes an outside move and gets there. Ryan, one of my favorite things about Jonah, though, is when he lines up on the interior. His move to the inside, his bull rush, him shooting a gap is so incredibly quick. And I think when you see the way that he does both of those things, from the outside and the inside, you see the explosion off the ball, the straight ahead athleticism makes him an absolute handful when he's shooting gaps on the interior. You're talking about a player who's a legitimate 6'3", 230, 235 pounds, runs in the 4.7s in the 40-yard dash, has a vertical approaching 30 inches, really good testing athlete. Ryan, he's the rare combination, too, of a track athlete that has some intriguing sprint times, but is also a guy that throws 48 feet in the shot put. And so when you look at what you want from a defensive lineman in terms of being able to go speed to power, he's a guy that has that. Picked up a Wyoming offer here recently, and I think he's a guy that will show up really well in a camp setting. And as he continues to fill out his frame, I think he's a little bit more of an interior guy than somebody who's going to stick at defensive end. Maybe he's a 4-eye type that could be kind of that hybrid a little bit, but because of that speed and quickness, he's somebody that I think a creative college coach that maybe moves his defensive linemen around a little bit could have a lot of fun with.
I was going to say, just wrapping it up on Jonah, I think, a lot of times we use the word tweener as kind of like a bad thing, right? It kind of catches you in no man's land. But I think in Jonah's case, his versatility, his positional flexibility is going to be attractive for a defensive coordinator to use him as a chess piece, because if he can get up and, get that body up closer to maybe 250 pounds, now with his track times, the acceleration, the explosion that you talk about, now he might be a little bit more intriguing to an odd man front, or he could be a little bit more intriguing to an even man front and be more of that interior, not quite nose tackle, but a pass rushing defensive tackle that maybe you can get up to 270, 275 pounds and still have some of that burst. So in his case, I think, as far as his body is willing to take him without losing that explosion, he could be, again, a chess piece for a defense.
We're obviously a football and recruiting show, but Ryan, we're also human. So we're ready for the NCAA tournament tipping off this week. I have to ask you, who's your Final Four?
Well, I hate my bracket. I hate it. This was like the toughest bracket of all time. I actually thought the right side of the bracket for me, when you're looking at it, was a little bit easier to piece together than the left side of the bracket. But ultimately, my Final Four ended up looking something like this, where I've got Auburn coming, would face Texas Tech on one half, and that was the side of the bracket that, to me, could have gone any different way. Like, Auburn felt too easy, but I didn't like anybody else there. Texas Tech, like, I love Florida, but you and I were talking, like, they're like too easy right now. Like, Florida was my hot pick a while back, and then they rattle off what they've done. I'm like, well, now I can't pick them. Like, you can't pick the hottest team in the country. Maybe I should have, though. And then I've got Alabama And I'm going Tennessee. Maybe this is Rick Barnes's year for whatever reason, Kevin. I think maybe, we talk about Houston's defense, but maybe Tennessee is the type of defense that can shut Houston down and then make their way to the Final Four. So I don't love it, but 3 SEC teams and a Big 12 team, and probably not the Big 12 team that most everybody else would have. But that's what I'm rolling the dice with, Kevin.
I hate how chalk my bracket went at the top. I also had Auburn and Alabama. Alabama being my only number 2 seed to get through. By the way, Nick Springer agrees with you in terms of Texas Tech making it through to the Final Four. I had Florida making it through there in Houston. I like ultimately Florida to topple Houston in the national championship game, but I think this is a year that looks a little chalkier than normal, which of course means that everybody is going to get upset and it's going to be a crazy tournament and something that nobody expected. But I also wanted to say, Ryan, shout out to Harlan Obioha, a guy that we covered. He's going to take the court this week for UNC Wilmington against Texas Tech. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Obioha is listed at 7 foot, 280 pounds. He's from Hoxie, Kansas, and he was an offensive tackle prospect at 7 feet tall. Had FBS offers to play offensive tackle in
Iowa State.
Iowa State, I believe, was one of those before ultimately deciding to stick with basketball. Selfishly, I kind of wish he would have stuck with football so we could have seen a 7 foot offensive tackle and kind of what that would have looked like with Obioha out there. But he's certainly making the most out of his basketball career. Really look forward to watching him against Texas Tech this week.
I'm looking forward to watching him and all the local guys. It is always surprising when you get into March Madness how many local faces are from Kansas City that are playing on the big stage. So that's always exciting for us.
Coming up, we'll have our interview with Central Michigan assistant coach Brandon Blaney. But first, let's chat about our friends over there at Home Field Apparel. If you're a Kansas or Kansas State fan, you should head on over because both schools have new items to check out as we round out basketball season and get further into baseball and spring football season. Kansas, Kansas State, and Missouri, all 3 of them have more than 40 items to choose from. So head on over to homefieldapparel.com and use your promo code link below in the description, and you can get 15% off your first order. We'll be right back.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network. Make sure you download our new app. Find it on the App Store or Google Play. Just search KC Sports Network.
Welcome back to the Verbal Commitment Podcast, sponsored by Home Field Apparel. We're joined by Brandon Blaney, the recruiting coordinator at Kansas, when the Jayhawks went to the Orange Bowl, and now coaching at Central Michigan. Coach, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, really fired up to be here on a spring afternoon here.
For those who maybe aren't familiar with your background, can you give us a little bit of a rundown? Because you've got you've got a lot of fires in different pots, from the NFL level to different schools, and also a lot of ties to the Midwest region, even beyond Kansas.
Well, I guess, the connections to the state of Kansas and the Kansas City metro area probably go back, to my childhood. I'm the son of a high school football coach. We had stops in Riverton, Kansas, Columbus, Kansas, Ottawa, Kansas, Blue Valley, when it was one high school. And then Lamar, Missouri, where I spent probably most of my childhood right there. So dad was a football coach. Grandfather was a football coach in Western Pennsylvania. I think my mother would say that it's a genetic flaw, but, decided that I wanted to be a football coach probably from about the time I was 12, 13 on. Went to college originally 1 year at the University of Kansas as a regular student and was an equipment manager for the team that first year. Knew that I really wanted to get into coaching and knew that my opportunity to get into coaching was going to have to go to a smaller school and try to grow within a program right there. And so I decided at that time to transfer after my freshman year to Youngstown State in Ohio in 1995. And was at Youngstown State under Jim Tressel from 95 to 99. And then had an opportunity to be a graduate assistant at the University of Oklahoma from 99 and the 2000 season right there. And in those two stops early on, we won the national title at Youngstown State in 1997, and then Oklahoma in 2000. And at that time, I thought, wow, this coaching stuff is going to be pretty easy with 2 national championship rings after that. And it ended up being there for 2 years, and then went back to work at Ohio State for Jim Tressel's first year there on the defensive side of the ball. And those were great experiences at Oklahoma and Ohio State. With Oklahoma, that coaching staff on Bob Stoops' first year was like an all-star staff that was out there. And, and I think, having that opportunity to GA directly under Mark Mangino was one of the first connections that I had, but also just learning the offense and learning a new offense from Mike Leach at that time with the air raid, in the early 90s or the late 90s or early 2000s, that was a significant step just in terms of my knowledge base right there. Then going to Ohio State with Jim Tressel for that second run, I jumped over to the defensive side of the ball. And our defensive coordinator at the time, we had a really good defensive staff. Defensive coordinator was Mark D'Antonio. And, our defensive backs coach was Mel Tucker. And, our linebackers coach was Mark Snyder, who later became the head coach at Marshall and had a couple stops in the SEC as well. After that, I had a chance then to come to Kansas in 2002 and was there from the 2002 all the way through the 2009 season. So all of Coach Mangino's years there at the University of Kansas. And then after that, went to work for Mel Tucker with the Jacksonville Jaguars for 3 years, worked under multiple head coaches at the time. So that was an education right there, working for originally for Jack Del Rio.
Was that when you worked alongside Ron Prince as well?
That was the second year that I was there. So the second year working with Ron Prince was under Mike Malarkey. And then after Mike, then went to work for Gus Bradley in his first year. And then decided that I wanted to jump over to the offensive side of the ball. And my best opportunity to do that was to go to Iowa State with Mark as the offensive line coach for Paul Rhodes for 2 years, so 14 and 15. And when that came to an end, I decided that I wanted to jump back to the NFL and work for Mike Malarkey again, and worked under a gentleman by the name of Dick LeBeau, our defensive coordinator right there. I probably was the best time in my life to go work for Coach LeBeau. And, I owe a lot of years since of staying in this business to him. After we got fired, we actually went to the playoffs, beat Kansas City at Kansas City, and then lost to New England, and then got fired.
It's a cruel world.
It's a cruel world. So after that, I ended up going to Michigan as a senior analyst, and Ed Warner, who was our offensive coordinator at Kansas during that Orange Bowl run, was the offensive line coach at Michigan. Just got named that, and needed an analyst spot, and I was available, and fortunately, got hired there, coached there for 2 years, and then went to Eastern Michigan for 4 years. And then just this past year, went to Central Michigan with, to Central Michigan for Coach Mack. And, then Coach Drinkle took over and was fortunate enough to get retained right there.
We want to get into some talk about, your time at Kansas, as well as stuff around the region, some general state of recruiting stuff as well. But first, just wanted to ask, what's the excitement level like in Mount Pleasant right now with Matt Drinkle coming over from Army? Because I know he's a guy that you've always held in really high esteem.
I think there's a high level of excitement right now. The thing that makes Central very unique is we're, obviously Central Michigan, you're in the middle of the state of Michigan, but like where we're located is is kind of in an area like University of Michigan and Michigan State are south of us. And we're really the largest school from the midsection of Michigan all the way north. And so it puts us in a unique position relative to a lot of G5 schools where you might have a couple of people in the area that follow your football program. When you're at Central Michigan, you've got basically half the state, following the program. And, there's a lot of excitement. I think that people want genuinely to have a winning program there and have a championship level program. And, we're fortunate enough to have great facility and enough backing right there where we feel like we can build something. And I think a lot of people are starting to feel, what that possibility could be.
Coach, you don't have to comment on this, but I just want to go back a second and say it definitely sounds and looks a lot better to say you worked with Ron Prince than for Ron Prince. So we'll leave it at that. We'll leave that at that.
I worked 2 times with Ron. Unbelievable person. Like every conversation I've ever had with Ron Prince, I feel much more better and much more intelligent for having those conversations. And I think Ron, 2 times, one at Jacksonville one season and one season at the University of Michigan as an analyst, shared an office with him. And, the impact that time made with me, with Ron, has made me see things as a football coach and, as a member of an organization in a completely different way. Like I would not trade a second of time for that.
Interesting. Well, let me go back then to you mentioned the time with the Jaguars and the Titans, and this might be one of several questions where we kind of, unravel some major, bigger, broad topics. But I'm curious, from your mindset of having been in the NFL and also lengthy college coach, how much of recruiting and coaching nowadays mirrors more that time with the Jaguars and the Titans? I mean, are you still approaching the business? And I say you, not just Coach Blaney, but you as the coaching profession. Do you still look at it and try and approach it like we're coaching and recruiting at the amateur level? Or are you starting to kind of rewire yourself that this is becoming the professional level here in terms of recruiting, coaching, developing?
I think that's a good question. I think the view of being an amateur football player, I think is really kind of gone out. Like there's a line of demarcation right now, maybe in our society, but at least in college football. And that line really, came to an end of what I would call the traditional college football era. And I think that ended probably with the 2019 season. And 2020 came in with COVID, but there were things happening in 2015 with the O'Bannon ruling all the way up, kind of gradually starting a little bit of a momentum, then an opening of the transfer portal and the ability to transfer, even before that, as soon as you graduated, being able to go to graduate school elsewhere. I think COVID ended up becoming an accelerant on that transition. And, I don't know if we can sit there and say it's been professionalized, because from a legal standpoint, it hasn't. But from an operational standpoint, I think that road of specialization, of a year-round coaching calendar and development calendar has been a long time coming. I can remember when I first got into this business in the late 1990s, that we would get through May and people would go home. We had maybe an athlete would be on your campus if they were, failing and needed the extra summer courses. And that changed. That probably changed around 1999. And, now you're seeing that players, that athletes really don't even leave campus. They may go home for a week or two, but they're going to be up and they're going to be working out, pretty much year round and all the way through the summer. And, I think now with the way that talent acquisition, namely with transfers go, that time in the summer That time, even in January now, are absolutely critical times in terms of the development. So, to your point, I don't know if the traditional model of how we perceive a student athlete really applies to the way that they're being trained right now and the way that they're operating.
Mm-hmm.
We are a local recruiting podcast, obviously, and with you having all the local ties, one of the things that we've talked about in the past, just you and I, is that if Kerry Meyer had come along today, he probably would have been a guy with a lot more Power 5 offers, a lot more attention. Nowadays, being a quarterback from Pittsburgh, Kansas, isn't a disqualifier for a lot of schools. It's a lot more global. People find you a lot easier because of Huddle. What's the biggest change you've seen maybe in the way that Kansas is perceived? I mean, is it just that, hey, in 2005, 2006, we weren't as good at finding these kids? Or is it also, they're getting more training, they're getting more developed, because all of a sudden you're seeing in some classes 25, 30 kids from the state of Kansas going to FBS schools?
I think, to be honest with you, I think it's all of the above. And I think there's a mix of different things. When I was at Kansas, I think we probably averaged like a good year for Division I football players in the state of Kansas was probably about 15. And we probably averaged about 10, during the 2000s of guys that could play in the Big 12 or play in Division I football. And, that number's practically tripled, on average every single year. Scholarship numbers haven't changed. So something has happened right there. Now, part of that, I think a big part of that has been just the quality of instruction and the quality of development that's happened with every single football program.
Yep.
When you put the tape on, compared to, 20, 25 years ago, it's a different ballgame that's being played. And, the level of teaching and the level of coaching that these young athletes have received is been a very significant improvement over the past few years. Now, the other issue is scope and scale of evaluation and recruiting from a college football standpoint. Now, originally when I first got into this, and I'm going to play the gray-haired guy right now, the process was something like this. Okay. I would hear of, Joey Prospect at, Liberal, Kansas. And I would then call the head coach at Liberal and, try to get some background information. And then I would send a VHS tape out to Liberal, Kansas. And then they would dub that tape about a week after receiving it and then send it back. And then we would watch it. So we had like these massive VHS tapes, but like that turnaround, if you think about it, like that turnaround for every single recruit was something like maybe a 2-week turnaround at the fastest. So,
I think just, and then you can continue your answer, but I think Coach Mangino actually mentioned at one point that a VHS tape that you guys got had been sped up that are a player to try and make it look faster. And that the way I happened noticed as a staff was apparently the cheerleader was doing some like super speed jumping jacks as this player was breaking into the open field.
Yeah, we thought the prospect had some fast twitch muscle fiber. We thought the cheerleaders had even more right there. No, I mean like those were things that happened right there, but like when you start to think about it, like that's a 2-week turnaround for every single prospect that's out there. Like you needed to have an idea, so what it gave you, like you didn't have the ability to go evaluate 1,000 different players at that given time. Yes. So, like nowadays it's totally different. Now I can just log on to a website. I can log on with like, Huddle, for example, and I can look up, immediately 1,000 different quarterbacks if I'm looking at quarterbacks right there. So, the scope is there. I think the biggest issue that you're going to run into, and I think this is where I think a lot of programs have gotten bitten pretty hard, in their evaluation over the last probably 10 to 15 years since the onset of huddle is you have all this information that's out in front of you, but you don't have a true comparison to make it on. And I think that's where people get into a lot of trouble. Now, talent evaluation, for college football is not an apples to apples process. It's totally different than basketball. And I think in basketball, as a frame of reference, if you're a power forward at age 14 and you're an elite power forward, chances are you're going to be an elite power forward 4 years later. I think that's pretty safe to say. In college football, it does not work that way. It's a much, much more speculative venture that we're into when it comes to evaluating a 15-year-old kid that still has yet to fully develop, just the physical aspects of the game. Now, certain positions, you might be able to get that evaluated pretty quickly, but when you're talking about a tight end, that's a different story. The development process that those guys go through, a lot of times they're a little bit late developers right there. So it's not an apples to apples comparison based on biology. And then it's not an apples to apples comparison based on location right there. And I think a lot of people get bit with, okay, this kid from Kansas, doesn't have the 100 time of a 10-3 kid in Florida or Texas. Therefore, he must not be as fast. And, that doesn't apply. Great case in point, great story. We had a coach named Tyrone Dixon who was from Western Pennsylvania, and we had a young man from Aliquippa that was he basically the same town, and was a defensive back, a very good athlete, could run, could cover, could play offense, and you should have seen him on the basketball court. It was unbelievable. But his track time wasn't that good. His track time was not great. Well, Darrelle Revis ended up going to Pitt, and and his track time wasn't that great. So, you can't sit there and make direct comparisons. You have to have an understanding of what the talent base is relative to that given prospect right there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Well, Coach, don't go anywhere as we want to continue this conversation. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
Success in real estate takes more than vision. It takes the right financial partner. When someone takes something rundown and turns it into something great, that's called a comeback story. Like Bryan Group. They take distressed properties here in KC, completely rework them, and then turn them into valuable real estate. But that kind of work needs the right bank behind it. Enter Emprise Bank. They're not about cookie-cutter loans. They saw Bryan Group's vision, backed them, and now they're making big moves in Kansas City real estate. Talk about your partner in possible. Emprise doesn't do one-size-fits-all financing. They invest in potential and back growth. Visit emprisebank.com/KC to learn more. Emprise Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
We're back on the Verbal Commitment Podcast, sponsored by Home Field Apparel, and we're here with Central Michigan's Brandon Blaney, who spent time at Kansas, Oklahoma, Ohio State, Michigan, and in the NFL. Coach, everyone wants to talk about NIL at the Power 4 level, but how does it impact what you guys do at the Group of 5 level?
I think you have to look at where college football is in the overall scope of things. We're at a process right now where, 5 to 10 years from now, college football is going to look probably a lot different than what we're seeing now, So I think what you're seeing is a stratification of this game, and with the fluidity of of talent of your players being able to move up, we're all faced with different challenges, and really the scope of how we develop and how we recruit is going to change with every single program that we're in at whatever level. I think if you're talking about an Ohio State, a Michigan, a Texas, an OU, those schools are going to be in a different set of circumstances and a different set of problems than we are. And I think you're going to see that like coaching staffs and the way that staffs are organized are going to have to reflect that reality right there. When you look at the ACC and the Big 12, I think their circumstances are going to be a little bit different than, the SEC and the Big 10, just in terms of like pure money to work with NIL money. Stepping down another notch down to the group of 5, obviously we're not going to have the same resources that, a Kansas is going to have or that a Nebraska is going to have. So that means that our staffs are going to be comprised a little bit differently. We're going to be a little bit more on the traditional model of how a coaching staff is put together and how we recruit and how we evaluate right there. I think the big difference that we're going to run into is like, what's the time frame of prospect development right there, of player development. When I first got into this business, everything was the same, whether we're talking Youngstown State, Ohio State, Kansas. It was, you bring in a young man from high school into the football program. You basically had 3 years to get him in a position to where he could play. And then after that 3 years was kind of like, has the investment been worth the output right there? That's a 3-year deal. That's a 3-year model. Teach a guy how to play that first year. He plays on scout teams. Then he might play on special teams his second year. And by the third year, it's time to be in the 2 deep. That's changed. I think like for everything except the offensive line and the defensive lines, it's now an 8-month cycle that we're talking. So we've gone from a 3-year cycle for a wide receiver or a defensive back to an 8-month cycle to get this person ready to go. So that means that every single second that we're in that building, and then when that young man's in the building, like he can't afford to have a bad day. He can't afford to have a bad rep or else he falls behind. Now, offensive line is a different story. That takes time just physically to be able to develop at that position. I think our biggest issue at the G5 level is not necessarily the development speed, but it's the retention speed. Once that person is performing at a pretty high level, if that person's performing early in their career at a high level, it's going to be hard to keep that person there for 4 years. So like in our case at Central Michigan, we've had Staley and we've had Eric Fisher, offensive tackles, that were first round draft picks. They came in. I wasn't there, obviously. I was at Kansas at that time, but they came in as I think maybe even tight ends, defensive ends, and worked their way and developed their way into that. The way that this schedule is working for a quality player like that, there's a pretty good chance that player, once he gets enough good tape out there, is probably not going to be at Central Michigan. He's going to be at Michigan or Ohio State. And so, the big thing is for us, I think like in the MAC, and I don't want to talk about like what our strategy is because I don't want to necessarily give that away.
Sure.
But I think talking around the MAC and being in a couple of MAC programs, I think there's basically 3 different approaches that people are trying to make right now. One is to operate exactly as we've been operating since 2019 and just keep on keeping on. And I honestly, I think those people are going to get ran out of the conference pretty quickly and in short order. The other model is taking the approach of there's a kid in Detroit. He's dreamed of going to Ohio State, or he's dreamed of going to Michigan or Michigan State, but those 3 schools haven't offered him. So he ends up getting contacted by Kansas or Missouri or somebody like that. And now it's like, okay, I can go play at those places. There's an approach that some of the schools are taking of, okay, why do you want to go to Kansas or Kansas State when you can come to Bowling Green or you can come to Eastern Michigan or what have you, whatever the MAC school is? you're going to play earlier.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to put out good tape. You're going to help us win. And then we're going to help you get to Ohio State. So that's another approach that other people are taking. The other approach is also, of saying, okay, look, we're going to take care of and prioritize recruiting in the area that we currently are in. And we're not going to venture too far out of that area. And, if that means that we're not going to take a kid that maybe has 3 stars out of Georgia to come up here, we may take a guy that has 2 stars in the state of Michigan and develop that person and develop that player. And if that player puts out enough good tape, they want to leave, there might be enough of a hook and enough of a connection into the university and into that because they've grown up here, they've played here, they're part of the culture here, that they may want to stay unless the payout's just too much. And then they'll have to cross that bridge. So that's another approach. The other approach, and I don't know if anybody's done this yet, but it's going to be interesting to see how college football plays itself out, is does a MAC program decide to integrate vertically with another major football program, meaning that like somebody at, let's use Ohio as a model. Let's say that somebody at Ohio State has decided, hey, I'm going to have a connection with Miami of Ohio now, and I'm going to funnel all of the players that I really like and I think are going to be really good into Miami of Ohio, and they're going to run the same offensive and defensive systems that we run, so the terminology stays the same, and then it works as a vertical farm system like
that,
in baseball.
That would be wild.
I don't think you can put those things out of a possibility.
Sure.
Would it be like the next sort of extension of, Ryan covered Bill Snyder. Bill Snyder used to place guys at certain
JUCO, exactly.
knowing that he would get them on the other end. But you're even talking about potentially basically them becoming a minor league system in terms of running similar stuff and all of those. It would seem like the next step.
It's not out of the realm of possibility. Now, I'm not saying that anybody's currently doing that.
Sure.
But what I do think is that I do think you have to challenge yourself to start really thinking outside of the box in terms of how college football is organized right now and the way things are. So, with the realities that we're facing right now, just with television revenue and with, any possibility of a separation that could be taking out, like all of those avenues are going to, be in play, and it's not an impossibility. But to be honest with you, I don't know if that necessarily can help you win in conference either. Because, at the end of the day, we can sit there and talk about like, hey, this guy signed like 3 5-star wide receivers at Akron, which is, not out of the realm of possibilities in the way this world's working right now. Somehow those 5-star athletes that didn't get recruited by Ohio State, but wanted to go to Ohio State, finally get on the field, they get the wins. You're hitting reset every single year if you're doing it right. Is that how you win in college football? Is it constantly taking an 18-year-old kid out of high school and teaching him how to play college football and constantly hitting reset after reset after reset? Is that the way that you're going to win? Or is it to be able to try to build your program so that you're able to retain, at least on the offensive line and the defensive lines, where the game's really won? Can you retain talent enough so that you can have those years where you have 4-year starters, where you have a group of 5 guys that have played together for 3 years, playing together and able to work with one another? Is it constantly hitting reset with a lot of talent, or is it building a team and building a culture and building a bond, and only time can build those things? So I think those are the questions that we've got to ask right there. I'm not advocating anything. by any stretch. But like there's a lot of possibilities that could be taking place, at the group of 5 levels. And, maybe I'm even missing a couple.
Let's stay on that same track then. And I want to, Kevin and I kind of get in these debates with whether it's parents or coaches or fans all the time. So I'm sure it's stuff that you've had conversations about as well, but who is getting hurt the most with the emergence of the transfer portal, with the scholarship numbers now and roster limitations and things like that? Is it high school? Is it JUCO, or is it what we'll call kind of lower level? And maybe that's basically everything below FBS, or if you want to say strictly like Division II and below, or is it like all of the above? But I'm curious kind of your take on, again, that seems to be a popular question right now, is who's getting hurt the most by what we would consider modern era recruiting and modern era college football?
I don't know. Like, I hate to say, like, and not to dodge it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I'll try to get to it, but like, I can't sit there and say whether somebody's hurt. And I think making value judgments on what is currently going on something that's happening, whether you like it or not. Right. I think you have to embrace the change. I think you have to, like, there's 3 different types of coaches that wake up every morning right now. Okay. There's one when the alarm goes off that he looks at the date on the clock and he goes, "Oh, geez, I thought I was going to wake up and it's going to be 2019. Okay. Then there's the other guy that hits that alarm, that sees the alarm, gets off, gets out of bed, and he's just like, well, here's the new reality. I guess I have to work in it. And then there's a third coach that wakes up and says, hey, look, it's a whole new world. Regardless of what state I'm in right now, I've got to function. I've got to find a way to win ball games. Now, which of those 3 coaches are going to survive in this business? I think it's probably going to be the latter right there. So we've got to embrace change. And, like the scenarios that I talked about earlier, like you got to decide on one of those scenarios as a coach, and then you got to march forward and make it happen. Now, are there people that are going to be placed at a disadvantage in this process? Unfortunately, yes. Okay. And that's not insurmountable, but I would venture to say that like the people that are going to be, not always in the best of positions on that may end up being everybody that's not a major blue blood, football coach or football player, to be honest with you. Everything kind of, it's almost like a little bit of a to the victors go the spoils, or to the larger places go the majority of the pluses on this deal. It's just a different world that we're in right now. And everybody, if you're looking at it from a standpoint of opportunities to get a foot in the door, there's a scarcity now. And that's just the reality. There's less spots, that are available, with roster contraction that we have. I think when you think of it in the traditional mindset of, signing at one place and playing there for 4 years and having that great experience, I think those are more and more limited as time goes. And, if anything, I think the athlete that even goes through the college football process is as great as an experience as it is, and as many opportunities as it gives you in life. I think everybody's going to be missing out on that, of the whole, hey, loyalty to a place and having an alma mater and having 4 years on average or 5 years on average at a given place. And, being a Chippewa for life. I think those are going to be difficult things. And, it's our mission as coaches to try to make that, such a great experience for them that they don't want to leave. And that's what our challenge is.
To your clock metaphor, when you look at the modern era of recruiting, do you think it's more difficult than it used to be? Is it the same as it used to be from a difficulty level? I mean, because obviously there was some wild west type recruiting things going on before. Has this evened the playing field out to some extent? Is it harder then, harder now? What do you think of the difficulty curve there?
I think it's different. I don't know if it's harder or more difficult. It's just different. I think, I think like pre 2019, I think all of us kind of, whether you're coaching at Central Michigan, Eastern Michigan, Michigan, Kansas, what have you, I think we all dealt with a lot of the same issues. Maybe some of the scales may have been a little bit different, or facilities might have been different. Maybe the meals might have been different, but we weren't talking like $200,000 different, So that's totally changed. That's totally changed on how we all operate at different levels. So, like the realities that somebody in the SEC or the Big Ten have in recruiting are going to be a little bit different than what they are, in the MAC or in the All-American Conference or what have you. I think the bigger thing is like when you're in the group of fives right now, you're not just recruiting for talent acquisition, you're also recruiting your own roster. And I think your priorities, I think as a coach, I think organizationally as a football program, like you've got to really determine what your priorities are and how you allocate time on task with your coaching staff. Is it acquisition or is it development and retention? And, I think you've got to be able to do a little bit of both, but at the end of the day, there's got to be an emphasis somewhere. And, I think somebody's going to win some football games acquiring a lot of talent. And I think there's going to be somebody that wins a lot of football games really focusing on retaining the talent. So somewhere in between, that's going to be important. But I think like the way you structure your staff and the way that you set those responsibilities and the roles, whether they're defined roles or de facto roles, have changed right now in college football. And, and I don't think the average fan has really grasped that yet. Heck, I don't even think there's a lot of head coaches that have fully grasped at how much that's changed and how those rules have changed. And, I think you're going to see over the next 10 years, a complete reframing of how coaching staffs and how the calendar's set. I'll be honest with you. Like when I first got into this business, it was in the 1990s, and the pioneers in the coaching profession of the 1990s, were in my mind schematic in a way. They were Mike Leach with the air raid, Rich Rodriguez in the one back zone reads, Urban Meyer with quarterback run game, spread football, like that was like the cutting edge, and that pushed the envelope. No huddle football, that pushed the envelope of college football right now. I think to the fans and to the athletic directors, to the media, the real pioneers, I think in this generation of football aren't going to be X's and O's. It's going to be people organizationally that have rethought how football programs operate, rethought how coaching staffs and support staffs are organized, and how the calendar that they're dealing with from January until opening date are reset, and how they're going to teach the game of football to an 18-year-old kid.
Mm-hmm.
So whoever masters that will be the Urban Meyer of this generation. But it's not going to be somebody that comes up with a new scheme. It's not going to be the traditional sense of how this game's played. It's going to be more organizational than anything else, because that's where college football is right now. The landscape is completely different than what it's been at any time that I've been in coaching, and really anybody that I know has even talked about right now. We're at a crossroads right now, and we're in kind of a brave new world. It's almost like organizationally, from a coaching standpoint, on a program standpoint, it's like going into a basement office, rearranging the entire room, turning out the lights and saying, okay, now go find the pen. That's the way college football is right now. So whoever can build that light and, reorganize that room is going to be the one that dominates this game of college football.
Okay, Coach, on a lighter note then from me, throughout all your years Maybe you can name players by name, maybe you can't, and that's okay. But give us maybe one recruitment that you knew, maybe specifically you or you guys as a staff, wherever you were, you knew that commitment and that signature was in the bag until it wasn't. And then was there one recruitment that you knew for certain, you're like, we're losing this recruitment, and then signing day comes and you won it?
I think the one that was that like the one that got away was probably and Kevin might even know this one. So like,
Can I guess real quick?
go for it.
Michael Crabtree.
That was up there. I just speaking as a tight ends coach, right?
Sure.
So, I think the one that got away was a kid named Christian Ballard. That was Lawrence, Kansas, and a Free State player. Like, absolutely loved the way that guy ran, played, everything. And, ended up going to Iowa when it was all said and done. But I'll be honest with you, like, I spent an entire summer like drawing up football plays. This is how we can use him. Like, this is going to be incredible. Hey, we're going to have a Mackey Award winner, all that type of stuff. And then it just didn't happen. So
For those who don't know it, and maybe it predates them or whatever, Christian Ballard was 260, 270. I mean, he was a big kid, like 4'6" type. He was a tremendous athlete at that size. Actually wound up being a pretty good defensive tackle. But it was a guy that like
the NFL.
you guys were going to throw the ball to.
Yeah. It was like, how many ways can we try to get the ball dealt out right there? That was one at my position, that it was just like that. Like, yeah, I it was like a death in the family practically losing him. The one that we actually signed that I was a little bit surprised when it was all said and done might have been Tim Beery out of Omaha West Side. And what you have to remember was it was 2007, came up to high school camp, knocked it out of the park, like just was incredibly coachable, like did everything that I could possibly ask for. And like, just like the learning curve was incredible with him. So I was fired up, and I felt like we got a good player that, was a little bit under the radar and really highly underrated. Right. So about midway in the season, his coach calls me and he's like, "Hey, look, Nebraska's starting to sniff around."
Here it comes. Yep.
And Bill Callahan comes in, and now we know that he's going to get offered by Nebraska. So Bill Callahan comes in, evaluates a game, they offer. Then Bill Callahan gets fired, and it's the first week of contact, right? And then Dr. Tom Osborne goes on the road for Nebraska, goes into the school and visits. So like, I'm getting calls from people, going, "Hey, Dr. Osborne was at the school today. You may want to try to follow up on that one." And then Bo Pelini, when he got the head coaching job, showed up, and, so 3 different Nebraska head coaches in there, and somehow the kid stayed with us right there. And, but I swear to you, I thought we were going to lose him. And, I think we were operating that way, that eventually he was going to switch over.
Well, and Tim kind of had that nonplussed personality too, where you're never entirely, like, he was just very level. So I can imagine, you weren't necessarily getting the feedback from him necessarily where he's like, "Oh yeah, coach, I'm all in. Like, I can't wait to get to campus." Like, he was always like he's a great person to talk to. He is.
Like, so like, it's kind of like anything else, like as a coach and as a recruiter, you're just sitting there going, "Okay, you're telling me this is great. You're telling me this is home, when is it not going to be?" It's great until it's not.
Hey, Coach, can I interject with one more question that I just thought of? At least one more from my end that I know I wanted to ask you. And this will be more for maybe the K-State and Missouri fans, right? Your rivals when you were maybe at KU or Iowa State. But like, was there a guy that ended up going to maybe a rival, but again, kind of had the roots of Kansas or Kansas City, was a local product that you were maybe banging on the table for? You're standing on the table saying, "This is a guy we got to have." and maybe at some point you got overruled, and then you kind of several years down the road got to say, I told you so. I told you we should have gotten that guy because he ended up turning out fantastic for somebody else.
I'm not going to sit there and talk about like the things that I banged on the table for and didn't get, because there were players that I did bang on the table for and it didn't work out either. So, it goes around both ways.
We all have those.
Yeah.
You talked about some more drug it didn't work out on the show. So
Yeah, I mean, so like I can't sit there and say, from a personnel standpoint, I'm a genius or anything like that. Honestly, like the way recruiting worked at Kansas, like it was a collective effort all the way around. So, like as a recruiting coordinator, you're more of an organizer, not like the chief GM of the program. So, there were times that we would cuss and discuss, and maybe there was a little bit of cussing at the time more than discussing. But we came around to a consensus, and we made it forward for better or worse. But that being said, I think just at the tight end position alone, I can remember in state there was Blake Bell, who was a quarterback that I probably was too honest with, in that I felt like he was an NFL caliber tight end and wanted him to come into the program as a tight end, not a quarterback. And, he wanted to be a quarterback. So that was one. I think the year before that too, I think there was another quarterback that we were recruiting out of Cleveland, Ohio, at a Cleveland Heights, named Travis Kelsey, who I thought was a pretty good tight end too, and thought it was a quarterback. So, yeah,
that would have been pretty nice.
Would have been nice.
So close on Joe Thomas, right?
I don't know about Joe on that one. I don't know on that one. But those two, Brody Eldridge was another tight end that was an exceptional tight end that Clint Bowen was the lead recruiter on. And like Clint basically was I think a member of the family at that point in time. And it was like one telephone call does it all with recruiting. And, I think like going into like crazy stories in recruiting.
Yeah.
Like here's one. So like when you're having, when you're building a program and when you're starting to have success, like what people do is they'll find out like who you're recruiting, and like no matter how well you build that relationship with, that's still the logo on your chest. And sometimes those logos can be really nice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was, I'm not going to say the university or the school, but there was a coach from another school that like mysteriously every single offer that I ever made, or every visit to an offerable place, that person would happen to show up like a week later. So one spring I decided to like go stop at Ulysses High School out in Western Kansas, and then Hoxie High School in Northwestern Kansas, and then another one in another corner, like, Eldridge or somewhere like that. And then Sedan maybe. And like, kind of got out that I was there and looking at these prospects, and what do you know? Right, coach hit all four of those high schools all the next week right there. And I'm sure he got a chance to see a good 150-pound, 5'9" offensive center. And
hey, I will say Ulysses is almost infamous for always having like a 5'6", 195-pound running back who is just an absolute fire hydrant that is darn near impossible to tackle at the 2A level. Like it's kind of what that whole town is known for. Is Smith Center has had 8 billion years of Krugers at quarterback, dating back to Lon Kruger. I think Ulysses is infamous for producing those fire hydrant running backs.
But it's funny, like you would go to certain places and you would offer a guy, and lo and behold, that school would follow you right behind and put that offer out, regardless of whether it was whether that person was a great fit for him or not.
It does feel like espionage was maybe a little bit bigger part of recruiting back then. Mark Mangino told me a story when I wrote for the Kansan, and I know both of you have heard this, about how I believe it was when he was at K-State. They were supposed to have a recruit fly out for a visit. They went to the airport. Kid wasn't there. Couldn't figure out what happened. Turned out another school had met said kid at the airport, basically kidnapped him for a visit to their school. Do you have any sort of wild kind of either throwing people off the scent or sort of counter espionage type stories from your time at Kansas?
I can't sit there and say that I kidnapped anybody. I do remember there was and I don't want to sit there again. I don't want to give the coach away or what institution they were from, but when they would go into Wichita, like I remember going in one school, and I can't even remember which school it was, but I can remember the school coming in and the coach being kind of disappointed when I came in, and I was like, conversation got there, and I'm trying to figure out why. It's like, well, how come the news trucks and the news cameras weren't out here when you got there? I said, what do you mean? He's like, well, when this one coach comes in, there's always a news camera or a news truck or a TV reporter that wants to interview me after he comes through. But come to find out, that guy had been like leaking to various media outlets what schools he was hitting, in the process. And we're not even talking like, the standard, but like the local TV stations. But those things happened, and maybe I just wasn't good at
you guys at least didn't have to deal with like the 50s and 60s stuff. I think Don Fambro used to tell a story. I believe it was Fambro, and I can't remember if it was his story or if it was something he was relaying about recruiting John Riggins out of Centralia. And basically people would come out there to do farm work to try and get in with the family when they were recruiting him. And I guess one of the rival schools, whether it was K-State or Nebraska or somebody, swung by and, tried to kind of be smart about it and be like, oh, I really thought this KU coach would be here. And they'd say, oh, he was here an hour ago. He's out back milking the cows. So a little bit different time period that you guys dealt with.
It's a different world.
And it's still happening today. I mean, I was telling Kevin a story not long ago, and I'm sure you've run into it before, Coach, where, there was a local school that, there was a situation where there were back-to-back official visits, and the first school, that visit is wrapping up, and it's kind of on that school to kind of basically finish the visit. What I mean by finish the visit is like get player from hotel to the airport and get him on the flight. The second school, obviously, set the flight up and everything to get him to second school. And, the Uber was late to get him to the airport, or, little things that are still happening.
An hour here or there. Yeah.
Trying to sabotage just even like you said, Kevin, maybe he still makes the visit, but, it kind of ruins that first day and you've got to reorg the entire visit. It's crazy what folks don't understand is happening sometimes behind the scenes.
I think I've been on the negative side of that a couple of times as a recruiting coordinator, but never did that intentionally.
Right.
I think at the end of the day, I think there's something to be said about having a level of integrity with what you're doing and a level of honesty right there, that you're not, selling somebody on a bill of goods. And maybe that's the old school side of me as a football coach, but I'm in this business not as an entertainer. I'm in this business as an educator. And, if somebody is going to commit to play at the school that I'm working for, hey, I want that to be a great experience for that person. And I want them to come to the place under the right circumstances right there. So, but yeah, it happens. I mean, those little tricks and those little things happen, and, I don't know how it's all going to play out over the next few years, when it starts to come down to, hey, what's the number on the paper, when that starts to drive things, it'll be, I think it'll change the dynamics a little bit of how recruitment's done, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse, who knows?
I had one more question, and it's not recruiting related, actually.
Absolutely.
Why did the Orange Bowl team work? I mean, you had, obviously up to that point, you guys had a lot of seasons where you were kind of almost there, right? Where you were playing a lot of close games, but you weren't quite getting over the hump. It wasn't a team that was super highly regarded in recruiting circles, and all of these different things. You make a coordinator change where you bring in Ed Warner before that 07 season. What was it about that team that just everything wound up kind of gluing together and working?
Yeah, the K-State fan in me, I'll just take my headphones off.
He's just going to leave the room for a minute. So,
there's a lot of I've given that a lot of thought, and I also have given a lot of thought up against, the national championship teams that I had been on at Youngstown State and at Oklahoma, the playoff team that I'd been associated with in the NFL. I think, and I think even when you sit there and you look at some of the building blocks on that Michigan national championship team too, because those guys were young players that were coming through, first year players. My second year there. I think the biggest thing is that you have a very strong senior group that has a very strong identity with who they are as a football team, what type of internal culture they have. And I hate to use the word culture, but like it's the sum of the pieces of being together. Like they genuinely liked each other. Like all those teams that have been high level competitors and they would compete to the death if necessary. They genuinely liked each other. They genuinely did things together. There was a sense of I don't want to say family because that really cheapens the term family, but like a feeling of a tribe, a feeling of a cohesive group of people that share the same values, that genuinely looked out for one another and kind of played like it was us against the world all together. So like that's to me is like the foundation and the glue that's there. All of those places have also had exceptional play at the quarterback spot, really good defense. And I think the other part, on the championship runs was that the injury bug didn't hit, very hard. And we were able to stay healthy, through that season. And that applied everywhere.
I was going to say, I've always said one of the most miraculous things about the Orange Bowl team was guys started to get banged up right at the end of the year. I think when you guys went into the Missouri game, you were pretty banged up with James McClinton. Anthony Collins had kind of rolled his leg against Oklahoma State. But other than that, you guys, I think, was Kendrick Harper the only starter to miss games that year? I mean, you guys were remarkably healthy that year. And I feel like that was in sort of an undersold part of it.
I think I can't think of, I mean, there were guys that played through injury, right? Yeah. A good number of those guys. I mean, Derek Fine was an absolute warrior.
Yeah.
Just in terms of like fighting through a meniscus injury, that what happened really in January going into his senior year. But like there were guys that played with injuries, but like didn't let on like it, until the end of the season, and I think again, that kind of goes to the cultural aspect of things, that, I think when you're so bought into one another, like you don't want to do anything to let those guys down. And, I think different coaches have a different way of fostering that environment to get it there. The way Jim Tressel did it was different than the way Bob Stoops did it and the way that Mark Mangino did it. I think they all did it within the ways of who they were as men and as leaders. And, it filtered down through the rest of the organization.
Coach, if there's a player who wants to get in contact with you at Central Michigan or parents who are interested in learning more about your program, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Probably on X. You can find our program on CMU football, and believe it's all, It's all right there once you type it in, or you can reach out to me and contact me at B_Blaney at Twitter.
Sounds great. You guys also, I think, have recruiting questionnaire up on your website, and you guys should be having your summer camps here before too long if players want to come out and show you guys what they can do.
Absolutely. And all of that information should be, on the sites right there.
Well, thanks so much, Coach, for taking the time to talk to us. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening to the Verbal Commitment Podcast here on KCSN. If you like what you've seen or heard, comment below, leave us a like, subscribe, or hit us with a 5-star rating. And until next time, we'll see you on the trail, and take care.